The morning mist clung to the Belgian countryside like a funeral shroud as Sergeant Mike O'Sullivan crouched behind the stone wall of a bombed-out farmhouse. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his M1 Garand, not from fear, but from the bone-deep cold that had settled into his bones after 3 days without proper shelter. December 18th, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was entering its third day, and everything was going wrong. The radio crackled with desperate voices. Units scattered, supply lines cut, German Panzers rolling through American positions like they were made of paper. O'Sullivan's company of the 82nd Airborne had been dropped behind enemy lines with orders to hold a crossroads near the village of Wereth. Simple mission: hold the road, deny German armor access to the main supply route. But nobody had told them about the Mark IV Panzer that was grinding toward their position at 15 miles per hour, its 75mm gun sweeping left and right like a predator searching for prey. Through his binoculars, O'Sullivan watched the massive steel beast emerge from the tree line 800 yards away. Its angular armor gleamed dully in the weak morning sun, and he could see the German infantry following in its wake. Maybe 30 soldiers, moving with the confidence of men who knew they had overwhelming firepower on their side. The math was brutal and obvious. 20 American paratroopers with rifles and a single bazooka against a 40-ton tank supported by a full platoon of Wehrmacht infantry. Army doctrine was clear about situations like this. Fall back, establish new defensive positions, call for armor support, wait for reinforcements. But O'Sullivan had read those manuals back in Georgia during training, and he had also spent the last 3 months fighting Germans across France and into Belgium. He knew what retreating meant. It meant giving ground. It meant letting that panzer reach the crossroads and punch through to the supply depot 5 miles behind them. It meant watching German armor cut off an entire American division from their ammunition and medical supplies. The bazooka team, Corporal Jenkins and Private Torres, had already set up behind a hedgerow 50 yards to O'Sullivan's left. Standard anti-tank procedure called for them to engage at maximum effective range, roughly 300 yards, and hope for a mobility kill or lucky shot through thinner side armor. But O'Sullivan had seen bazooka rounds bounce off Panzer frontal armor like pebbles off a windshield. The rocket's shaped charge warhead could penetrate 68mm of armor under perfect conditions. The Mark IV's frontal plate was 80mm thick. O'Sullivan pulled out his field notebook, the same one he'd been sketching tactical problems in since Normandy. His mind was already working angles and distances, the way he used to calculate shipping routes back when he worked the docks in Boston. Every problem had a solution if you looked at it from the right perspective. The Panzer's strength was its armor and firepower. But strength could become weakness if you changed the geometry of the engagement. Before we continue, I want to know where you're watching from and what you know about unconventional tactics in World War II. Drop a comment below and let me know if you've heard stories about paratroopers taking on tanks with nothing but ingenuity and courage. These men wrote the book on improvised warfare, and their solutions often defied everything the military textbooks taught. The German tank was following the most obvious route toward the crossroads, a dirt road that ran between 2 hedgerows. Perfect concealment for the Panzer, but also perfect channeling terrain. O'Sullivan realized that the Germans were thinking like tankers, not like infantry. They were using the road because it offered the fastest, most direct approach to their objective. But that predictability was about to become their greatest vulnerability. O'Sullivan gathered his squad leaders around him behind the farmhouse wall. Sergeant Williams from Chicago, who'd been fighting Germans since North Africa. Corporal Martinez from Texas, who could thread a rifle shot through a keyhole at 200 yards. Private First Class Anderson from Minnesota, barely 19 years old, but already a veteran of 3 combat jumps. These weren't green recruits. They were seasoned paratroopers who'd learned that sometimes the most effective tactics were the ones nobody taught in training. The plan O'Sullivan outlined was insane by conventional standards. Instead of engaging the Panzer at maximum range with their single bazooka, they would let it approach to within 50 yards. Then, while the tank was channeled between the hedgerows with limited maneuverability, they would attack from multiple directions simultaneously, not to destroy the Panzer, which was probably impossible with their available firepower, but to separate it from its infantry support and force the crew to button up inside their steel coffin. Williams shook his head when he heard the plan. "Sergeant, that thing will be close enough to use its machine guns on us. We'll be sitting ducks." O'Sullivan met his eyes steadily. "We're sitting ducks right now if we do this by the book. That 75mm gun can reach out and touch us from 800 yards. But if we let it get close, real close, then we change the rules of engagement." The key insight was understanding what tank crews feared most, not anti-tank guns, which they expected and trained to fight, not air attacks, which they could see coming and take evasive action against. Tank crews feared close infantry assault because it neutralized their primary advantages of range and armor protection. A tank was nearly invulnerable to small arms fire at long range, but at point-blank distance, determined infantry could exploit its blind spots and mechanical vulnerabilities. O'Sullivan had observed this during the fighting in France. German Panzer crews became cautious and defensive when American infantry got within grenade range. They would button up their hatches, limiting their vision to narrow periscope slits. They would traverse their turrets frantically, trying to engage multiple threats they couldn't clearly see. Most importantly, they would slow down or even stop, making themselves stationary targets for any anti-tank weapons the infantry might have. The plan required precise timing and absolute trust between the squad members. Jenkins and Torres would remain in position with the bazooka, but instead of engaging immediately, they would wait for O'Sullivan's signal. Meanwhile, the rest of the squad would split into 3 teams and move to predetermined positions along the hedgerows flanking the dirt road. When the Panzer reached the kill zone, all 3 teams would simultaneously open fire with everything they had: rifle rounds, grenades, even rocks if necessary. The goal wasn't to penetrate the armor, but to create chaos and confusion. Martinez raised the obvious question: what happens when that tank crew realizes we can't actually hurt them? O'Sullivan had thought about this too. German tank doctrine emphasized maintaining momentum and pushing through infantry resistance, but that doctrine assumed the tank crew could see clearly and maintain communication with their supporting infantry. If the paratroopers could create enough noise and visual distraction, the Panzer crew might make mistakes. They might stop to assess the threat. They might separate from their infantry support. They might even retreat to reorganize. Anderson, the youngest member of the squad, asked quietly, "What if it doesn't work? What if they just keep coming?" O'Sullivan looked at each man's face, seeing the same mixture of fear and determination he felt in his own chest. "Then we improvise. We've been doing it since we jumped into Normandy. Nobody taught us how to fight in hedgerows, but we figured it out. Nobody taught us how to take out machine gun nests with nothing but rifles and grenades, but we made it work. This is just another problem that needs solving." The sound of the approaching Panzer was getting louder now, the deep rumble of its Maybach engine echoing off the stone walls of the farmhouse. Through the morning mist, O'Sullivan could see the massive barrel of its main gun probing ahead, like the snout of some prehistoric predator. In 10 minutes, maybe less, that gun would be close enough to reduce their defensive position to rubble with a single well-placed shot. O'Sullivan checked his watch and gave the signal. The squad dispersed like shadows, each man moving to his assigned position with the silent efficiency that separated elite airborne troops from regular infantry. They had trained for moments like this, though never exactly like this. Every exercise, every combat jump, every firefight had been preparation for the next impossible situation where conventional tactics wouldn't work and survival depended on thinking faster than the enemy. The German infantry was closer now too, their Feldgrau uniforms barely visible through the morning haze, but their voices carrying clearly across the frozen fields. O'Sullivan could hear their casual conversation, the kind of relaxed chatter that came from soldiers who believed they were advancing against a broken and retreating enemy. They had no idea that 20 American paratroopers were about to turn their textbook armor advance into a nightmare of close-quarters chaos. Private Torres whispered into his radio headset, his voice barely audible above the rumbling engine noise. Tank at 400 yards and closing, infantry spread out behind, maybe 25 meters back. The bazooka rocket felt heavy in his hands, its olive drab paint worn smooth from handling. He'd fired these things in training dozens of times, but never at a target that could fire back with a gun capable of vaporizing him and everything within 30 feet. From his position behind the hedgerow, Corporal Martinez had a perfect view down the dirt road. The Panzer was following the path of least resistance, exactly as O'Sullivan had predicted. German efficiency working against them for once. The tank commander was probably studying his maps, planning the next phase of advance, confident that his 40 tons of steel armor made him untouchable by whatever ragtag American forces might be scattered in these woods. What the German crew didn't understand was that they were no longer fighting a conventional battle. This wasn't tank versus anti-tank gun or armor versus armor. This was about to become something much more primitive and personal. 20 men with rifles and grenades, and the absolute determination not to let a single German vehicle reach that crossroads alive. The Mark IV ground closer, its tracks churning through the frozen mud with mechanical precision. O'Sullivan could see details now that made his stomach tighten. The additional armor plates welded to the turret front. The machine gun mounted coaxially with the main cannon. The vision ports that gave the crew nearly 360 degrees of observation when they kept their hatches open. all advantages that would disappear the moment his men opened fire and forced that crew to button up inside their steel tomb. Sergeant Williams had positioned his team along the right side of the road, using a drainage ditch for concealment. His men carried every grenade they could find, plus several they'd improvised, from explosive charges and metal fragments. The grenades wouldn't penetrate the Panzer's armor, but they didn't need to. Exploding against the hull and turret, they would create a thunderous cacophony that would make communication inside the tank nearly impossible. The psychological effect was just as important as the physical impact. Tank crews were accustomed to fighting at distance where they could identify threats and engage them methodically. Close-quarters combat turned their protective armor into a claustrophobic prison where every sound outside could mean incoming anti-tank rounds or satchel charges. The human mind, even a well-trained German tank crew's mind, didn't handle that kind of stress well. Anderson's team held the left flank, positioned behind a stone wall that had probably stood for centuries before this war turned peaceful Belgian farmland into a battlefield. His job was to eliminate the German infantry support once the shooting started. Without their foot soldiers to screen for threats and provide security, the Panzer would be operating blind in hostile territory. Tank commanders hated that feeling more than anything else in warfare. The genius of O'Sullivan's plan wasn't in the firepower they would bring to bear, because frankly, they didn't have much. It was in understanding that tanks and their crews operated according to predictable patterns. German armor doctrine emphasized speed, momentum, and overwhelming firepower applied at the point of decision. But that doctrine assumed clear fields of fire and good situational awareness. Take those away, and even the most advanced tank became vulnerable to determined infantry. 300 yards, 200. The Panzer's engine note changed as the driver downshifted for better control on the muddy road surface. O'Sullivan could see the tank commander now, a figure in black leather standing in the cupola with his binoculars scanning the hedgerows ahead. Professional, competent, following his training exactly as he'd been taught at the Panzer School. In 60 seconds, that training was going to collide with American innovation in the most direct way possible. The supporting German infantry had spread out into a loose skirmish line, their Mauser rifles at port arms as they advanced through the fields flanking the road. They looked confident, experienced, the kind of veteran troops who'd been pushing Allied forces back for the past 3 days. What they didn't know was that they were walking into a killing ground that had been carefully prepared by men who specialized in impossible odds. O'Sullivan keyed his radio one final time. All stations, this is Lone Wolf. Target is at 100 yards. Remember, we hit hard, we hit fast, and we make them think there's a full company of us out here. On my mark. His thumb hovered over the transmit button as he watched the massive steel beast roll closer to the point where geometry and timing would shift the advantage from German engineering to American audacity. The moment stretched like a held breath. 20 paratroopers against a Panzer and its escorts. No air support, no artillery, no reinforcements coming, just rifles and grenades and the kind of tactical thinking that didn't appear in any manual because it couldn't be taught in a classroom. It had to be learned in places like this, where following doctrine meant dying and survival required writing new rules on the spot. 50 yards. The Panzer commander was scanning directly toward O'Sullivan's position now, those German optics searching for any sign of resistance. In another few seconds, he would spot something, maybe the glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel or the unnatural outline of a helmet against the hedgerow. The window for surprise was closing fast, measured now in heartbeats rather than minutes. O'Sullivan's finger tightened on the radio button. Everything they'd trained for, everything they'd learned about fighting Germans, everything they understood about turning weakness into strength was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. The math was still brutal. 20 men against a tank. But math had a way of changing when you rewrote the equation from scratch. From scratch. O'Sullivan pressed the transmit button. Mark. The hedgerows erupted in gunfire. 20 M1 Garands opened up simultaneously, their distinctive ping of ejecting clips creating a metallic symphony that shattered the morning silence. Muzzle flashes strobed through the mist like deadly fireflies as 8-round clips emptied in controlled bursts. The sound was overwhelming, amplified by the confined space between the hedgerows until it seemed like an entire battalion was engaging the German column. The effect on the Panzer crew was immediate and dramatic. The tank commander dropped into his cupola, like he'd been slapped by an invisible hand, slamming the hatch shut with a metallic clang that echoed across the battlefield. The massive turret began traversing frantically, trying to identify targets through periscope slits that suddenly seemed impossibly narrow. The steady rumble of the Maybach engine faltered as the driver instinctively hit the brakes, unsure whether to advance into the firestorm or reverse to safety. Martinez's team unleashed their grenades in a coordinated barrage. The explosive devices arced through the air and detonated against the Panzer's hull and turret, with thunderous crashes that made conversation inside the tank impossible. Fragments of metal and stone ricocheted off the armor plating, creating a hellish percussion that would have the crew's ears ringing for hours. The psychological impact was exactly what O'Sullivan had calculated. Inside that steel box, the German tankers couldn't tell the difference between harmless rifle rounds and armor-piercing shells. Williams opened fire on the supporting infantry with devastating precision. His team's overlapping fields of fire caught the German soldiers completely off guard as they tried to process what was happening to their armored support. 3 Wehrmacht soldiers dropped in the first volley, their confident advance dissolving into chaos as the survivors dove for whatever cover they could find in the open farmland. The Panzer's coaxial machine gun began chattering, spraying bullets wildly into the hedgerows without clear targets. The gunner was firing blind, hoping to suppress whatever American force had materialized from the morning mist. Tracer rounds zipped overhead and smashed into tree branches, but the random defensive fire only confirmed to O'Sullivan that his plan was working. A confident tank crew would have identified specific targets and engaged them methodically. This was panic fire from men who'd lost situational awareness. Torres raised the bazooka to his shoulder, but O'Sullivan's voice crackled through his headset. "Hold fire." "Not yet." The sergeant was watching the Panzer's behavior, reading the crew's reactions like a poker player studying his opponent's tells. The tank had stopped completely now, its turret spinning in slow circles as the commander tried to assess threats from multiple directions. Perfect. The German crew was thinking defensively instead of offensively. Anderson's team concentrated their fire on the German infantry's left flank, using the stone wall as a firing platform for sustained, accurate shooting. The Wehrmacht soldiers were caught in the open ground between the road and a distant tree line, pinned down by rifle fire from concealed positions they couldn't locate. Their return fire was sporadic and poorly aimed, the kind of shooting that came from men more concerned with finding cover than engaging targets. Inside the Panzer, Obergefreiter Klaus Müller pressed his eye to the gunner's periscope, trying to make sense of the tactical situation developing around his tank. The Americans seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, their muzzle flashes appearing from different locations with each volley. His radio headset crackled with the tank commander's increasingly frustrated orders. Traverse left. No, right. There, behind that hedgerow. No, the other one. The confined space inside the fighting compartment, normally a source of security and protection, had become claustrophobic. Every grenade detonation against the hull sent shockwaves through the crew compartment, and the constant ringing of rifle bullets off armor plating made communication nearly impossible. Müller could hear Feldwebel Hoffmann, their tank commander, shouting orders from the cupola, but the words were lost in the mechanical noise of the turret traverse and the cacophony outside. O'Sullivan watched the Panzer's turret movement becoming more erratic and realized the psychological pressure was working exactly as intended. German tank crews were trained to dominate the battlefield through superior firepower and armor protection, but that training assumed they could see their enemies clearly and engage them at optimal ranges. Blind firing at unseen opponents went against everything they'd learned at the Panzer School. The supporting German infantry was falling apart under sustained rifle fire from multiple directions. Their Unteroffizier was shouting orders, trying to organize a counterattack, but his men were scattered across 50 yards of open ground with no mutual support. Anderson's marksmen were picking off anyone who tried to move, forcing the survivors to remain pinned in whatever shallow depressions they'd found in the frozen earth. Corporal Jenkins had been tracking the Panzer through his rifle scope, studying its movement patterns and crew behavior. He could see that the tank commander was no longer standing in his cupola, which meant the crew was operating with severely limited visibility. The machine gun had stopped firing, either because the gunner couldn't identify targets or because he was conserving ammunition. Most importantly, the Panzer wasn't advancing. It was sitting stationary in the middle of the kill zone, like a confused steel elephant. "Lone Wolf, this is Ranger 2. Martinez's voice came through the radio. "German infantry is breaking. Half of them are pulling back toward the tree line." O'Sullivan allowed himself a tight smile. The Wehrmacht soldiers had been trained to work in coordination with their armored support. But when that support became a liability instead of an asset, their tactical cohesion collapsed. The Panzer's main gun fired suddenly, the 75mm cannon belching flame and smoke as it sent a high explosive shell screaming toward William's position. The round impacted 20 yards short, sending up a geyser of frozen earth and rock fragments. The crew was firing at suspected positions rather than confirmed targets, another sign that they'd lost tactical control of the engagement. Williams immediately shifted his team's position, moving 50 yards down the hedgerow before resuming fire. This was basic infantry doctrine, but it had the desired psychological effect on the German tank crew. From their perspective, the American force had absorbed a direct hit from a 75mm cannon and continued fighting without missing a beat. How many enemy soldiers were they facing? O'Sullivan keyed his radio again. All stations, Phase 2, light them up. The rifle fire intensified as his men began firing as rapidly as they could work their bolts, emptying clip after clip into the general vicinity of the Panzer. The sound was tremendous, like a full company conducting a fire exercise. Brass casings ejected from 20 M1 Garants created a metallic rain that caught the weak sunlight as it fell into the frozen grass. The gamble paid off in ways O'Sullivan never imagined. The Panzer crew, convinced they faced overwhelming American forces, abandoned their position and retreated toward German lines. 20 paratroopers with rifles had accomplished what anti-tank guns couldn't. They'd proven that superior thinking beats superior firepower every time. Sometimes the best tactics are the ones nobody teaches because they can't be learned from manuals. They have to be written in moments like this, where following orders means dying and survival requires rewriting the rules entirely.